But I also think there's other dimensions that we also need to bring into the conversation that we're having this week, and hopefully, for in future discussions, conferences, when it comes to reparations and reparative justice, is the issue of the gender and feminist lens to this conversation. Because for far too often, there's always this minimization or minimalist approach in appreciating that there is a dimension in the conversation that is often either misanalyzed or misrepresented about how important that part of the narrative needs to be more mainstreamed in the conversation. And so with that, I'd like to ask one of our respondents to the lecture to please come forward and give us that perspective. Ms. Dinah Musindarwezo, who is an international consultant on gender and development, to please come and give us your reflections. Please, let's give her a round of applause as she comes up.
That has delivered, as I've already been introduced, my name is Dinah Musindarwezo, and I want to acknowledge feminists in the room that have made sure that these conversations are happening in terms of linking the conversations on economic justice and debt to feminist analysis and perspectives, but also acknowledge feminists who are outside the room that have done this work. And my analysis, of course, draws from so many other feminist scholars and activists that have done this work in different ways, either in writing, in speaking, in activism, mobilization, etc. So I do like Comrade Roger's lecture, but a few things I wanted to really pick out in terms of the feminist perspective. One is around looking at the historical inequalities, such as colonization and enslavement, etc., and how that has impacted women specifically. So really looking at the gendered impact of colonialism and enslavement, and doing a contextual gendered analysis of that, in terms of how that has impacted women, historically, but also currently, because even up to today, the colonial project has continued to inform and shape the economic system that we have today, and that has a gendered impact in terms of how it impacts diverse women and girls on the continent, but also those of African descent that are not on the continent. And so that's the first submission I want to make, is really looking at the historical injustices, but also really looking at how the different systems of oppression are working together to oppress specifically women and girls and gender diverse people. Yeah, of course, looking at the intersection of oppressive and exploitative systems of power, including colonialism, racism, enslavement, but also imperialism and capitalism, working together to oppress diverse women. That's one. The second one is also to look at issues of reparation beyond individual compensation, to actually looking at how they do impact the entire system. And therefore, there's a need for looking at an approach that needs to transform the system that is going to be beneficial and work for everyone. Because you can definitely compensate individual cases, but colonialism impacted our education system, our health system, our culture, our traditions. And so looking at it individually is not going to really be very helpful, I think those financial compensations should happen, but it should go beyond that and really look at how to transform systems that would benefit all of us. That's the second one that I want to submit. But also my submission is also really looking at The contributions, yes, that's what I really want to talk about. The contribution of African women and African feminists specifically in terms of the historical struggles, the struggles of feminists, date back in, the struggles and resistance against colonialism. And oftentimes those struggles are not well documented, they are invisibilized, they are erased. So how do we make sure that we do recognize, we do document, and we do celebrate those contributions from the historical, struggles, but also the current struggles in terms of fighting injustices, including, debt crisis. Because I do feel that if we don't center and those contributions, we also miss their analysis and the value that is being added. And again, that feeds into already the current systems of operation, the economic system that we have, that already invisibilize the contributions of women, whether it is in terms of unpaid care work that oftentimes is invisibilized, is not seen as productive, is not paid for, is not acknowledged. And so again, I think we need to have a transformative approach to how we recognize and celebrate those contributions. I do, in Comrade's presentation, he talked a lot about climate change, but I think it is really important. You cannot talk about climate change without talking about the impact that, the disproportionate impact that climate change has on women in terms of how it impacts them, but also their contribution in resisting, the exploitation of environment. And so again, I think it is really to be very critical in terms of analyzing, having a feminist analysis of questioning things, questioning why things happen the way they happen, because that's the only way we're going to have a different system. Otherwise, if we have a critique of colonialism and imperialism, without a feminist analysis, it will be very difficult that we won't reproduce the power inequalities that already we are critiquing. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for having me again. I want to talk about 8 or 9 things, but I will try and go through them as briefly as possible. So my reflection is more about what his conversation has triggered for me as the keynote. And so I want to sort of walk you through some of the things that I've been doing on issues around debt and currency and remittances, and how these have so much reflection in the conversation that we're having today. And the first one is my report that's coming out in October, which I present to the General Assembly in a month. And the reason I think it's really important is because one of my current favorite phrases is that there's blood on the budget lines. And it gives people goosebumps, but there's a reason. Because no matter what we talk about, at the end of the day, as long as that there is profit out of something, that is where you're going to see the issues. And as we say in my country, that's where the rubber hits the road, literally. So my report in October is going to be on financing peace, which is basically about what is the type of economy a country has. And when you look at the economies that had slaves, what was the thinking? So what was the type of economy? It was free labor, right? That was the concept, that was the backbone of it. And then you move across to what is now in this sort of modern day space we're in. And for me, the conversation is about war economies or peace economies. Are you an economy that makes profit by the manufacture and production of arms? And so for me, these are the questions that have started popping in my mind as I continue to listen. And so when we're talking about intergenerational loss, and we're talking about death that is also intergenerational, when I then look to, and maybe we cannot measure, I hear that conversation, but certainly there is a formula to it. There is something that has to be quantified. And for me, the quantification is about not just the descendants of slaves and slave families, but also the descendants of the people that were lost in the sea. There's also the loss of the states from whom those people were extracted. So there is a multiple pronged effect. And remember that also it happened in our continent. People were drafted into the armies as well. So we didn't just lose people through slavery, but we lost them also through being part of a military enterprise. And then that takes me to the second conversation, which is, so what are the financial solutions that I see popping up everywhere? And one of the things that I noticed, we are in the era of the UN tax convention, absolutely. But the pandemic treaty is stuck on the financing formula. Climate finance is stuck on the financing formula. The plastics treaty is stuck on the financing formula. And when you go and you look at the debates the United Nations is going through right now, the biggest conversation is about financing. So money has become and has continued to be, I think, a critical part, but perhaps now it is much more visible than what it was before. And that takes me to the third issue. We ended that era of slavery, and then what happened? We had the creation of tax havens. Countries were not asking for independence because they didn't see how they were going to be economically and financially feasible. And so what happens? They set up the tax haven system. That was the British solution. And this is documented data. But this continuation of use of the economy then rolls itself even more and more. But I want to come to a close because I do also want to hear the conversation. There were 3 letters that I wrote over the past 4 years to different entities. I wrote a letter to the IMF asking them how they measure surcharges. And you know, they cannot explain it. They cannot explain why one country pays a higher interest rate than another one. And Dinah and I were chatting during the speech, and she was asking me, well, why are we rated higher or lower than others? These are conversations we have to put on the table. Right now, African governments are setting up risk insurance funds to attract investment into the continent so that if that investor loses out of taxpayer money, we're going to ensure that they don't lose out. But that means we're losing twice or 3 times. We're not using local capital, we're using foreign capital. If the foreign capital is unsuccessful, we're using taxpayer money to guarantee the money going back to them. So even the way the system is designed in so many ways continues to cause a lot of concern for many of us. And so I want to come to an end with the one last one, which is that I did write a letter to BlackRock because BlackRock owned part of Zambia's debt. And at that point in time, there was full agreement from all creditors except one, BlackRock. It took 4 years. The last time I spoke to the Zambian government a couple of months ago, they told me they still haven't come to a full agreement on the restructuring of their debt. So we're now on 7 years. But Ukraine's debt was renegotiated and sorted out in 4 months. This is a country at war versus a country at peace. I want you to imagine this parallel, right? Now, 7 years on, still no agreement. There was one holdout, a private creditor. When I wrote to BlackRock and I asked, why are you holding out? They said, oh, the money they owe us is really a very small amount. But that misses the point, right? You're trying to remove that pressure from multiple creditors so the country has time to pay for education, pay for healthcare, figure out what it's doing so that it can build itself. And for me, these are the layers of the conversation that I could almost hear echoing through his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Comrade Roger, Dinah, and Professor Waris. I think what's striking in all your submissions for me is that, and those who are students of history will say, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because when you want to link the militarization economy or the military economy complex, you can date it back to the lecture that Comrade Roger has just given us, because there was a lot of violence associated with the forced displacement of people of African descent from the continent to other parts of the world. When you talk about the intersectionalities or the exclusion and marginalization on impacts and analysis, that's exactly what was going on when they're talking about compensation and not paying attention to who the victims actually are or who the disproportionately affected by these atrocious activities actually are. When you talk about the international financial architecture, and in fact, it's interesting you mentioned tax havens, because as soon as he mentioned Lloyd's in his speech, Lloyd's is also a beneficiary of a massive taxpayer bailout in the United Kingdom and had to restructure its entire operations during the global financial crisis in order to receive and qualify for a massive cash taxpayer bailout in order to remain in business. So, and then of course, yeah, the establishment of tax havens to facilitate and store illicit financial flows. I think, all of those things seem to be ingredients of what is our current state of affairs. And so I'll have you both still stay here because I think it's important to get the rest of the room involved. So I don't know if anyone would like to open up the floor and just give a reflection on what Dinah, Professor Waris, or Comrade Roger has made. Yeah. Crystal, you are the first one.
Thank you for the really interesting keynote, Comrade Roger. Thank you, Dinah. Thank you, Attiya. Dinah, the point on being like work being seen, and a lot of people measure slavery and what it was an injection into global North economies of free labor. And they count it as the labor of the slaves on the plantations, and I think that was reflected in the presentation. What doesn't come through, like you said, is the work, and I think Attiya, you also made reference to this, the work of women in reproducing slavery. Somebody had to birth the slaves, someone had to take care of them, had to feed them, had to do all of that. And I'm really hoping there's some sort of analysis. I guess maybe we have to do the analysis of what that was worth in current day metrics and costs. And then also, Attiya, the financing, this idea of financing, and we all seem to be obsessed with the term development. And when I speak to my friends and colleagues in Addis, Dereja being one of them, although I don't know if you've gone home recently. The idea of development that has captured us is this mega infrastructure, big roads, tall roads, big buildings, cement and concrete, literally doing away with life as we've known it, with nature, with trees, with community. And this idea of the narrative of development and financing development rather than financing, as you said, peace or financing dignity. I think the narrative and description of what we term as development also needs to be opened up, and what we're taking these billions of dollars in terms of financing and privatization, which is, put in our faces, but it is a new form of debt. My country, Kenya, is falling into these debt traps through PPP agreements. And these PPP agreements don't prioritize life at the center of it. It's, what gets paid fastest, and if it's not profitable, it comes off taxpayers' money. And so if a maternal unit isn't profitable, that's kind of off the books in terms of investment. So a correlation between description narratives, definitions, what they really mean for life, and recentering what we should be fighting for rather than this financial boogeyman.
Thank you very much, Crystal, for those reflections. Yes, sure.
Thank you very much, the guest lecturer. It was very, very incisive. My name is Paul, I'm from Nigeria. Recently, Germany returned some artifacts to Nigeria, specifically, if you know the history of Nigeria, to the Oba of Benin. Several artifacts that were stolen years ago, they were returned after a series of campaigns. I think if you're familiar with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, at a time she addressed the German parliament, and I think building on that, they are able to return some of the artifacts. But one important thing people are still asking, which we are still asking, they only returned artifacts. But what of after several years, if you are to return those artifacts, to quantify what the years that it has stayed in your shapes in Germany, people are still concerned that they need to pay more restitution for Africa. Now, one thing that is causing the Europeans and the civilized world to keep on holding to all the things, assets that have been looted from Africa, is the issue of corruption, which they are using to hold our leaders. For instance, in Nigeria, and they keep telling us that, just as you said, you know, the several billions of naira that were stolen by past governments, they are now telling our government that for them, giving them condition that for them to return it, they have to be satisfied that corrupt leaders are not going to reloot them. Now, the question I want to ask the guest lecturer, what framework should African leaders put in place to ensure that these Western nations, these Western countries that are still holding on to our resources, our stolen funds, what framework should African leaders put in place to ensure that when these assets are finally returned, that they are not going to be relooted, and still give these leaders the strength to keep on holding our resources?
Thanks. Derek.
Thanks. Not much to add, but just to say, both the lecture and the inputs of the discussants was very fine and very interesting. But what I want to add is to put a bit of addition to the current situation of backlash. Just to mention, for example, Trump is the campaign is doing against the museum, saying they show only things which are bad about slavery. And to quote, I just found it now. To quote Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of the UK, the continent may be a blot, Africa. The continent may be a blot, but it is not a blot upon our conscience. The problem is not that we were once in charge, but that we are not in charge anymore. And then another one, the best fate for Africa would be if the old colonial powers or their citizens scrambled once again in her direction on the understanding that this time they will not be asked to feel guilty. So there is a backlash of emerging racism is also has to be part of our narrative in addressing these issues. Thank you.
Ken.
Hello, everyone. My name is Victory, and I have a question. But firstly, I would love to thank Comrade Roger, Dinah, and Professor Attiya for your insights. So my question goes thus. On a larger scale, when these debts are forgiven, what would you advise is the easy way forward? Because the kind of leaders we have in Africa, it is predictable that some nations will still go back to these international banks to ask for more money. So what strategy can we put in place as activists to mitigate these actions?
I also wanted to thank the keynote speaker and also those who have been discussing. For me, looking at the conversation on reparations, it can take a historical perspective. So most of the time, we are looking at what we lost as Africans. But some of these things are continuing right now. There are companies, or you see Donald Trump talking about the deal in DRC and saying openly that this is because we want to extract. there are companies right now that are charging us higher interest rates, like Attiya was saying, right now. They are not things that happened in the previous century. There are those international organizations like WTO that is making, for instance, avocado from my country not go to Europe and be sold there because they are favoring other companies that are from Europe and the rest. What are we going to do about what is happening now, even as we are talking about reparations of what we lost in the past? Thank you.
I know there's going to be quite a number of questions, comments, but maybe just to take some of those and start with Comrade Roger, if you're still with us, just to try and respond, react to some of what's coming out from the participants in the room about all these different dimensions. So, Roger, over to you.
There was a few points I wanted to make. I think the points about the importance of looking at the climate emergency through the lens of women and through the lens of feminism, I think is so, so important. One of the ways that it's easy to kind of imagine what's happening, even if you look at this in terms of when water gets scarce, it's the women who generally the ones who are going out and fetching water. They have further to go, lengthens their day, means that they have to do more. So there's a massive practical dimension to this, apart from the fact that women are going to go hungry. They're going to go thirsty, the same as everybody else. But there's the additional burdens, if you like, that the women have to go through in terms of being able to make sure that the rest of the family are looked after, because of the way that work is still unfortunately divided between men and women in large parts of Africa and the global south. But the point was made about how do we make sure that women aren't just seen, I suppose, as just being providers and doing and not contributors towards liberation movements. I think that's a really, really important point. And one of the important parts for me about that is about how we can facilitate women being given the space to write their own stories. One of the best stories that I've seen in recent times is a book, I think I've got the title right, it's called Belly of the Beast. And it was written by a longtime friend of mine. Her name is Stella Dadzi. And she wrote about how women who were captured in Africa and were on the ships being forced over to the Caribbean and to Brazil and to North America, how they kept seeds in their hair and carried a lot, and because of them, many of the foods that are now staples within the Caribbean are originated in Africa, and are only in the Caribbean because women were able to bring those things over. So they had the foresight to do that. So I think women being able to write their own histories is an important part of what we need to be promoting if we're talking about liberation for Africans. Because, of course, a lot of African history has been written by people who are not Africans. And where it has been written by Africans, it's been a lot, predominantly, I would say, written by men. And that has to change as well. Interesting about BlackRock, I think. Of course, the new Chancellor of Germany is the BlackRock man. And interesting with BlackRock, with Germany being called out over their genocide within Namibia all those years ago. Again, not so very long ago. I think it's interesting and one for us to take into account in terms of how we deal with it. If BlackRock and the German Chancellor is so close, the biggest economy in Europe, then how are we going to deal with that in terms of making sure that there's reparatory justice for, in terms of what the Namibians have been seeking? I think the issue about the stolen loot from Africa is something that, as I said within my contribution, something that particularly annoys me. In London, we have the so-called Benin bronzes, which of course aren't bronze at all, but they're called the Benin bronzes. Really important sacred artifacts that were looted and spread all over Europe. But there's this massive collection in London, most of which isn't actually on show. And what gets me is what comes to my mind with this whole argument about where they say, well, you just wouldn't look after it properly, or there's too much corruption, as if they look after it properly, as if there's no corruption in Europe at all, which is absolute patent nonsense. But if somebody robs your house and you identify the burglar, you identify the culprit, why is it acceptable for the culprit to be able to say, yeah, but having made loads of profit off this already, as they would have, we're not, you say you just wouldn't look after it properly if we gave it back to you. It's not theirs, it's our property. But how can we make sure that that property isn't subject to abuse by some of these misleaders, as I call them, who are across Africa? Well, frankly, that's for the people locally to determine. I believe there needs to be radical change, but I also believe where some of these misleaders are removed, but it's not really for somebody sitting on the outside to say how that should be done. I think that's the height of arrogance, frankly, for somebody sitting outside the continent to tell the people of Africa what to do to rid themselves of these misleaders. I was disturbed, might be one description, hearing that name Boris Johnson again. I thought we got rid of him from Britain. But he's actually part of a wider problem that's taking place around the West, well, certainly in Britain and much of the rest of certainly Western Europe and certainly the United States at the moment, where there's this resurgence of racism and where they're not even pretending anymore that they are apologetic about their racism. The days of the murder of George Floyd, where for a few weeks they even had some kind of reticence about coming out with their racism, and so many of them, they made an art form out of taking a knee, where you couldn't. Sometimes it felt like you couldn't turn around without tripping over a leading politician or a leading figure somewhere taking a knee and claiming how desperately against racism and they were, only for them to go back into the institutions that they were in to commit more acts of racism. These people also need to be removed, but we also need to take charge of the narrative, because it's that narrative that we have experienced for many, many years, which is about the whole thing about dehumanizing us as people of African descent. All, they still try and paint us as being primitive, as being stupid, where, as Jason was saying earlier on, where they always feel that they have to kind of minutely explain things to us as if we were little kids. You know, they have to explain in the kind of detail because we're not clever enough to be able to understand what is happening around us, and we're certainly not clever enough to be able to look after things that are ours. Except if you look around the continent of Africa, you'll see many examples of where actually it's people coming in from Western Europe and looting and damaging African institutions and property that has caused those institutions and property to be in a state of disrepair. And frankly, they are the ones who are responsible for the lowering of standards, the underdevelopment of Africa over the years. I looked over to my left because I still have on my shelf here the wonderful book by Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And if folks here haven't read that, this is staple, and people should really read it because it explains these issues much better than I could ever hope to do. So part of what I'm saying, and I'll conclude on this bit, is that questions about what we should do as people of African descent, wherever we find ourselves on the globe, are for us as people of African descent, and are not for people who are not of African descent to tell us what to do. Imagine what would happen if we were to tell Europeans, this is how you should go about your business. If the boot was on the other foot, as the expression goes, they simply wouldn't accept it. But we are expected to continue to be treated as children with no minds of our own, with no ability to take our business forward, whether it's on the continent itself, on the mother continent itself, or whether it's as Africans wherever we are across the diaspora. Thanks.
Very much, Comrade Richard. Roger, sorry. I don't know if Dinah or Prof. Waris want to come in to react to anything that was said from the floor. I'm cognizant of time, so maybe if you do, please, no, there's no pressure.
I think just to comment on Victory's question in terms of what is the easy way out, and I'm really not happy to report, unfortunately, that there's no easy way out, because we're also working on really structural, historical, deeply rooted issues that we can't get easy way out, and also linking it to like our government still asking for funding from northern countries. I think the system of international aid itself is problematic because it continues to, I think to Comrade Roger's point, it continues to almost justify why northern countries feel they can't tell us what to do, how to do it, when to do it, because, you know, because of also the international aid system in place. I think we need to do away with it, you know, because it has no accountability framework. It comes with conditionalities that are not necessarily allowing space for our countries and our own people to set priorities of the needs and interests of the African people and the communities. And so, yeah.
So I think there's this positivity in the space from an African perspective, and I think it's important to share. So for example, we have an African credit rating agency. It's going to be the first ever public rating agency in the world. And while they were setting it up, the entire time, the 3 rating agencies that do exist, which are private companies registered in the United States that have no rules and regulations governing their structure specifically, they have actually downgraded the Africa Exim Bank. And there are conversations happening as to what the connection is between all of these. So here you see an encouragement of an African rating system and then a rejection of it by the 3 rating agencies that exist. You know, there is this sort of byplay. So there are these pockets of positivity and push that are coming out from different regulatory spaces that I think can be quite useful to join in onto. The second very positive but also very political issue is the issue around the de-dollarizing. So before any African countries were ever independent, they decided, whoever they are, decided that the dollar was going to be the global currency of exchange. Now, the moment a government changes, as you're now seeing in the United States, what you see is a complete change in how the dollar is being utilized in a very political way, and it's actually undermining a lot of countries around the world. So these are conversations I think that we're almost at the tip of, and I think the one thing I think is really important is what's the definition of development? And that is a really important conversation, because the definition where I come from is the right to development, which is an African concept. But when you hear development, you don't see that uptake at a global level. Countries, when they give aid to developing countries, don't turn around and say, how are you going to achieve the right to development? They use their model. So there is a need to sort of bring that into the forefront. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think let's give Roger, Dinah, and Professor Waris a round of applause. Thank you. As we wrap up, I think there's probably very many of us in the room who are wondering who is Opa, and my very valiant attempt to define or describe who Opa is perhaps may not have done him the justice that he deserves. But comrades, friends, even those who are online, including Comrade Roger, I want to take this opportunity to ask Opa to just please come up. And I'm sorry for ambushing you, just to say a few words as we close. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. And I would like to thank Roger, Attiya, and Dinah also for the contribution, as well as those from the floor. Just to say that the kind of historical processes that Roger was talking about, yeah, those historical processes were also structural. They were so structural that they have led the continent today to be in a state of underdevelopment. Well, not development, underdevelopment. So these concepts and ideas, we need to revisit and understand what underdevelopment means. Among other things, it means that there are processes and structures which are inhibiting, stopping you from moving forward. Those kind of things we need to understand better. But those historical processes clearly led to structural issues which put us in underdevelopment, dependency, and marginalization. So we're talking about international financial architecture. I think we should know that we're marginalized in those processes. But there are structural issues. So the subject of decolonization, right, is important to keep alive, because that is something that I hope can provide a basis for the African transformation, structural transformation that we're looking for, that we have stated in the Africa we want, Agenda 2063. So we must keep our focus on Africa we want, Agenda 2063, and how we, all of us, can contribute to achieving that goal, those stated transformative processes. I think I'll stop there in that sense. So I want to thank the board of Aphrodite for having set up this series of lectures, and also for sustaining the lectures in the long term. And yeah, I think I would like to thank everybody. And now you know who Opa is. Yeah.